If you fly into Las Vegas at the right angle, you can see it from the airplane window. A white ring, like a bathtub stain, circling the canyon walls around Lake Mead. That ring is about 170 feet tall now. It marks where the water used to be. And everything built between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, every casino, every swimming pool, every acre of lettuce, every subdivision with a 3-car garage, was built on a promise that the water would always be there. The promise was made on November 24th, 1922, in a room at Bishop's Lodge near Santa Fe, New Mexico. 7 men representing 7 states sat across from a federal negotiator named Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, not yet a president, not yet a scapegoat. And they divided a river. They split the Colorado into an upper basin and a lower basin, each entitled to 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year. Later, another 1.5 million was promised to Mexico. Add it up, and you get roughly 16.5 million acre-feet committed every single year, forever. The river didn't have that much water. It never had. But nobody in that room knew it, because the measurements they were using, stream gauge records from 1899 to about 1921, happened to capture the wettest period the Colorado River Basin had experienced in 500 years. That's not a guess. Decades later, scientists studying tree rings in the upper basin reconstructed stream flow going back to the 1490s and found that the years Hoover and those 7 commissioners relied on were an anomaly. The actual long-term average was closer to 13 million acre-feet, maybe less. Some recent estimates put it at 12. So the 7 men carved up a river that didn't exist. They allocated phantom water, and on the strength of that allocation, the United States government authorized the most ambitious piece of infrastructure the Western Hemisphere had ever attempted. And America built a civilization in the desert. The Colorado River, before anyone tried to control it, was a monster. 1,400 miles long, draining parts of 7 states and a slice of Mexico, fed by snowmelt in the Rockies that turned it into a seasonal fury. In the spring, it flooded, not gently, not predictably, but in surges that could raise the water level 30 feet overnight and wipe out everything in the bottomlands. In the late summer, it shrank to a trickle in some stretches. It carved the Grand Canyon, which tells you something about its temperament. A mile deep, 18 miles across at its widest point, cut by a river that had nothing but time and violence. The Colorado moved roughly 160 million tons of sediment a year, so much silt that early settlers called it the Red River and compared its water to flowing brick. Before the dam, the river's delta at the Sea of Cortez was a rich green estuary nearly 2 million acres wide. Jaguars hunted in its thickets. The indigenous Cocopah people fished its channels for centuries. All of that would vanish. In the early 1900s, a land speculator named William Beatty dug the Alamo Canal to bring Colorado River water into a desolate stretch of Southern California desert he'd optimistically named the Imperial Valley. It worked. The land bloomed. Farmers moved in. Then, in 1905, the river broke through the canal's headworks, and for 2 years the entire flow of the Colorado poured uncontrolled into the basin, creating the Salton Sea by accident. The Southern Pacific Railroad spent $3 million plugging the breach, a staggering sum in 1907, and never got a dime back from the federal government. The lesson was clear. Private capital could not tame this river. Only the government could. By the 1920s, Los Angeles was growing faster than its water supply. The city had already stolen the Owens River. William Mulholland's famous aqueduct, completed in 1913, carried water 240 miles from the eastern Sierra Nevada to the San Fernando Valley. But even that wasn't enough. The Owens River watershed was running dry. Southern California needed another source, a bigger one, a permanent one. And the Colorado was right there, vast and violent and unclaimed. That's what drove the urgency behind the 1922 Compact. California was developing so fast that the other 6 basin states feared it would establish such overwhelming prior use claims to the river that nothing would be left for them. Hoover brokered the deal to freeze the game, to guarantee shares before any single state could drink the whole glass. The deal needed a dam to enforce it, a structure massive enough to store years of river flow, control the floods, and generate the hydroelectric power needed to pay for itself. Congress authorized the project in 1928 with the Boulder Canyon Project Act. President Coolidge signed it on December 21st. And then the Depression hit. By the spring of 1931, a quarter of the American workforce was idle. Men who had built skyscrapers, laid rail, operated machinery, men with families, were standing in bread lines or riding boxcars west, chasing rumors of work. The rumor that turned out to be true was a dam in Black Canyon on the Nevada-Arizona border, about 30 miles southeast of a dusty railroad town called Las Vegas. Las Vegas in 1930 had a population of 5,165. It was about to get very crowded. The contract went to a consortium called 6 companies, 6 Western construction firms that pooled resources because no single company was big enough to bid on a project this size. Utah Construction, Morrison Knudsen, Kaiser, Bechtel, Pacific Bridge, McDonald, and Kahn. Their winning bid, submitted on March 4, 1931, was $48,890,955, just $24,000 above the government's own internal estimate. The man who crunched those numbers was their construction superintendent, Frank Crow. Crow was a Canadian by birth, an engineer by training, and an obsessive by temperament. He had spent 20 years working for the Bureau of Reclamation, building dams across the West, and he'd been dreaming about the Colorado River Dam since 1919, when he helped produce one of the earliest cost estimates for the project. When the government shifted dam construction from in-house to private contractors in the mid-1920s, Crow left his government desk. His motto was, "Never my belly to a desk," and joined Morrison Knudsen specifically to position himself for this job. He had spent his whole career rehearsing for it. "I was wild to build this dam," he said later. "I had spent my life in the river bottoms, and this meant a wonderful climax, the biggest dam ever built by anyone, anywhere." Workers and their families had begun arriving in 1930, a year before the contract was even awarded, sleeping in cars and tents and shanties in a makeshift settlement called Ragtown on the flats near the river. There was no housing, no sanitation, no shade. Temperatures pushed past 120 degrees. Children got sick. The government eventually built Boulder City, a planned federal town 6 miles from the dam site, designed by the Denver architect S.R. DeBoer. But it wasn't ready for its first residents until late 1931. And even then, houses were going up so fast that Crow threatened to fire carpenters who didn't finish 2 every 3 days. Boulder City was a federal reservation, which meant the government controlled everything. No gambling, no liquor, no union halls. 30 miles away, Las Vegas offered all 3, and the contrast between the company town and the wide-open railroad town would shape the culture of southern Nevada for the next century. That summer of 1931, before any concrete was poured, before the river was even diverted, the temperature in Black Canyon averaged 119.9 degrees Fahrenheit. 16 workers and local residents died of heat prostration between June 25th and July 26th alone. Men worked 7 days a week, mucking out tunnels, drilling into canyon walls, breathing carbon monoxide from gasoline-powered trucks that 6 companies refused to replace with electric vehicles. Nevada mining law banned gasoline engines underground, but the company argued that the tunnels were technically not mines, and a panel of federal judges agreed. Workers were hauled out of the tunnels unconscious, limp, loaded onto boats like, as one witness remembered, cordwood. Company lawyers classified the deaths as pneumonia. On August 7, 1931, 6 companies cut wages for tunnel workers. Within hours, the entire workforce struck. 1,400 men walked off the job. Their demands were modest: ice water, flush toilets, compliance with state safety laws. Crow met with the strike committee the morning of August 9th and told them that not only were their demands refused, but all work was being stopped and the entire labor force was fired. They had until 5 o'clock to leave. The men took their paychecks and went to Las Vegas to wait. 2 days later, law enforcement cleared the rest. By August 13th, the company was hiring again, at the same wages, with the same conditions. The strike was over. There was a depression on. The men who walked out knew they could be replaced by 100 others sleeping in their cars on the road from California. That leverage was worth more to 6 companies than any piece of machinery. To build the dam, you first had to move the river. 4 diversion tunnels, 2 on the Nevada side, 2 on the Arizona side, were blasted through the canyon walls, each 56 feet in diameter, running nearly 3 miles total. The river was rerouted through these tunnels while workers scraped the canyon floor down to bedrock. Then the concrete began. The dam was poured not as a single monolithic slab. That much concrete would have taken over a century to cure, generating enough heat to crack itself apart. But as a grid of interlocking columns, individual blocks 5 feet high, cooled by 582 miles of steel pipe circulating refrigerated water through the wet concrete. Crow patented the massive steel buckets, 7 feet tall and 7 feet across, that delivered 8 cubic yards of concrete at a time, swung into place on aerial cableways he designed. At peak production, his crews were pouring concrete at a rate no one had achieved before. Despite the myth, no one is buried in the concrete. Each bucket only raised the level in a given block by an inch or two, and teams of puddlers worked the concrete smooth. But the project was brutal in every other way. The official death toll is 96, though many historians count it higher, as many as 187, depending on whether you include heat stroke victims, men who died in transit to the hospital, or workers who succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning that company doctors diagnosed as pneumonia to avoid liability. Lawsuits dragged on for years. 6 companies settled out of court in January 1936, sending checks to all the plaintiffs. By then, the dam was nearly finished. Here is the strangest true story about Hoover Dam. On December 20th, 1921, a Bureau of Reclamation surveyor named J.G. Tierney was working along the Colorado River in Black Canyon, scouting potential dam sites, when he was caught in a flash flood and drowned. His body was never recovered. He is generally considered the first person to die in connection with the dam project. Exactly 14 years later, December 20th, 1935, to the day, his son, Patrick William Tierney, an electrician's helper, fell to his death from one of the intake towers on the Arizona side of the completed dam. Patrick Tierney was the last person to die on the construction project. The first death and the last, father and son, the same date, 14 years apart. On September 30th, 1935, 10,000 people crowded into Black Canyon in 102-degree heat to watch President Franklin Roosevelt dedicate what he very pointedly called Boulder Dam. The ceremony was originally scheduled for 2 in the afternoon Pacific time, but someone realized too late that the radio slot Ickes had reserved was for 2 Eastern. So they moved the whole thing forward 3 hours, and the crowd baked in the morning sun instead of the afternoon sun. Roosevelt avoided mentioning Herbert Hoover by name. Hoover was not invited. Harold Ickes, Roosevelt's Interior Secretary, was determined, he wrote in his diary that day, to try to nail down for good and all the name Boulder Dam. Roosevelt's party was still blaming Hoover for the Depression, even though this dam was authorized under Hoover's signature. Congress would restore the name in 1947, after the political grudge had cooled. But on dedication day, the petty rivalries of Washington were dwarfed by the thing itself. Roosevelt stood before a dam 726 feet high and 1,244 feet long, 660 feet thick at its base, containing 4.5 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a 2-lane highway from San Francisco to New York. It had been completed 2 years ahead of schedule, under budget, at a cost of $49 million. The architect, Gordon Kaufman, had been brought in to redesign the dam's visible elements in a streamlined Art Deco style, stripping away the ornamental Gothic detailing from earlier plans and giving the structure the clean, muscular appearance it has today. The sculptor, Oscar Hansen, placed two 30-foot winged bronze figures on the Nevada abutment, flanking a flagpole, and embedded a terrazzo star map in the plaza floor, depicting the northern hemisphere sky at the exact moment of the dedication, so that future civilizations, if necessary, could calculate the precise date the dam was consecrated. Hansen said he wanted his work to express the immutable calm of intellectual resolution and the enormous power of trained physical strength. These were people who thought in centuries. This morning, I came, I saw, and I was conquered, Roosevelt said. What the dam conquered was the desert itself. Hoover Dam's 17 turbines began generating electricity in 1936. Los Angeles, which had guaranteed its power purchases to help finance the dam's construction, built a 226-mile transmission line to carry that electricity home. In 1937, Southern Nevada Power became the first utility to deliver power from the dam, and Las Vegas was its first customer. Fremont Street, a dusty commercial strip in a town that still didn't have 10,000 people, was suddenly ablaze with electric signs. They called it Glitter Gulch, and the name stuck because the lights never went off. Nevada had legalized gambling in 1931, the same year construction began, and also shortened its residency requirement for divorce to 6 weeks, turning Reno and Las Vegas into destinations for unhappy spouses from states with stricter laws. The combination of cheap power, legal vice, and easy divorce proved commercially irresistible. In 1932, the first full year of dam construction, more than 200,000 visitors came to Las Vegas. 2 years later, it was 250,000. The dam workers themselves were the first market, thousands of young men with wages and no families in a town 30 miles from a federal reservation where gambling and drinking were banned. Entrepreneurs and organized crime figures recognized the opportunity simultaneously. By the time Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo in 1946, the template was already set. A desert city that existed to entertain people, powered and watered by a dam that existed to tame a river. But electricity was only half the gift. The other half was water. In 1928, the same year Congress authorized the dam, 13 cities in Southern California formed the Metropolitan Water District, an entity whose sole original purpose was to build the Colorado River Aqueduct. In 1931, voters approved a $220 million bond issue to pay for it, the equivalent of roughly $3.75 billion today. That bond financed the most ambitious public works project in Southern California history, employing 35,000 people over 8 years to build 242 miles of canals, tunnels, siphons, and 5 pumping stations powerful enough to lift Colorado River water over mountain ranges and across deserts. It drew water from Lake Havasu behind Parker Dam, a smaller dam downstream from Hoover built with Metropolitan Water District funds, and delivered it all the way to the coast. The aqueduct reached full operation in 1941. Think about what happened next. Southern California in 1930 had a population of roughly 3 million. The Colorado River Aqueduct, feeding off the stored water that Hoover Dam made possible, turned the tap on for an entire region. The aqueduct could deliver more than 1 billion gallons a day, enough water to fill the Rose Bowl every hour and a half. Homes, factories, shipyards, aircraft plants. World War II made Los Angeles one of the country's most important defense production centers, and all of it required water. Douglas Aircraft, Lockheed, North American Aviation, the Kaiser shipyards in the harbor, a wartime industrial complex that drew hundreds of thousands of workers west and kept them there after the war ended. By 1950, the city of Los Angeles alone had 2 million people, and had become the fourth largest city in the United States. The San Diego Aqueduct came online in 1947, extending the Colorado's reach to the Navy's Pacific Fleet headquarters and the booming communities of San Diego County. Between 1952 and 1961, the Colorado River Aqueduct was enlarged to its full delivery capacity of over 1.2 million acre-feet of water annually. Today, the Metropolitan Water District serves over 19 million people across more than 130 municipalities in 6 counties. More than half of the city of Los Angeles's water still comes from the Colorado system. And it wasn't just cities. The All-American Canal, also authorized under the Boulder Canyon Project Act, carried Colorado River water to the Imperial Valley, that same stretch of desert where William Beatty's speculative canal had breached in 1905. Only this time, with Hoover Dam regulating the flow, the water came reliably, predictably, year after year. The Imperial Irrigation District holds the single largest entitlement to Colorado River water, roughly 3 million acre-feet annually, about 70% of California's entire share. With that water, Imperial County became an agricultural powerhouse. 2/3 of the winter vegetables Americans eat, the lettuce, the broccoli, the carrots, the cauliflower, come from this single desert valley, generating $2.3 billion in agricultural sales as recently as 2021. The valley uses more water than Los Angeles, a city with more than 20 times its population. The district manages over 3,000 miles of canals and drains. 1 million gallons of Colorado River water flow through that system every minute. Then there was Arizona. For decades, Arizona had been the holdout, the only state that refused to ratify the 1922 compact, fearing California would take more than its share. Arizona sued, and in 1964, the Supreme Court ruling in Arizona versus California finally established that California couldn't use more than 4.4 million acre-feet. Arizona got 2.8 million. Nevada, the state that actually sits next to the dam, got 300,000, the smallest allocation of any basin state, a number that seemed perfectly adequate for a state whose largest city had barely 65,000 people in 1960. To deliver Arizona's share, the federal government built the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile system of aqueducts, tunnels, pumping plants, and pipelines running from Lake Havasu to Phoenix and Tucson, the most expensive water delivery system the Bureau of Reclamation had ever constructed. It began pumping water in 1985 and can divert an average of 1.5 million acre-feet per year. Phoenix, which in 1950 had a population of roughly 107,000, exploded. The city had air conditioning by then, another post-war technology that made desert living tolerable for people who weren't raised in it, and the combination of cheap land, cheap water, warm winters, and cold air created a migration pattern that reshaped American demographics. Scottsdale, Tempe, Mesa, Chandler, Gilbert, the subdivisions rolled across the desert like a tide, each one green and irrigated, each one with a pool in the backyard, each one drawing from the same river. Between 1950 and 2000, the Phoenix metropolitan area grew from about 330,000 to over 3 million people. Today, about 40% of Phoenix's water comes from the Colorado. City officials point out, correctly, that Phoenix has banked water underground, diversified its sources, reduced per capita consumption. What they say less often is that the Colorado River allocation Arizona depends on carries the most junior water rights of any lower basin state, which means Arizona takes the first and deepest cuts when shortage is declared. The numbers are staggering when you step back and look at them together. More than 40 million people across 7 states now depend on the Colorado River. It irrigates over 1 million acres of farmland. Its hydroelectric dams power 1.3 million homes. Las Vegas, which had 5,165 people the year before the dam was announced, now anchors a metropolitan area of well over 2 million. Phoenix is the fifth largest city in the United States. Los Angeles is the second. Tucson, San Diego, Denver, Salt Lake City, Albuquerque. All of them drink to varying degrees from the same source. All of them are drawing on the promise made in that room in Santa Fe in 1922. The promise that was wrong. The water started to go missing around the year 2000. It wasn't dramatic at first. Snowpack in the Rockies came in light. The spring runoff was disappointing. Lake Powell, the reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam upstream from Lake Mead, began to drop. Lake Mead followed. The Bureau of Reclamation tracked the numbers and waited for the cycle to turn. Wet years always followed dry years. That was the pattern in the gauge records. Except the gauge records only went back to 1906, and those records, as the tree ring scientists had been warning since the 1970s, were not representative. What was actually happening was a drought, not a temporary dry spell, but a structural shift. By 2022, scientists studying tree rings going back to the year 762 confirmed that the ongoing 22-year drought in the upper Colorado River Basin was the worst in at least 12 centuries. The smoothed annual flows on the Colorado were lower than at any other time in the past 1,200 years. Climate change was compounding the problem. Warmer temperatures meant more evaporation, less snowpack, earlier melt. The river's average flow had declined by roughly a third from its 20th century levels. Lake Mead, which when full holds about 26 million acre-feet of water and stretches 115 miles behind the dam, began its long, terrible retreat. The white mineral ring on the canyon walls, calcium carbonate deposited by the lake over decades, grew wider every year, a geological stain recording in real time the gap between what was promised and what actually existed. In 2000, the lake was near capacity, around 1,215 feet of elevation. It hadn't been that high since 1983. Year by year, foot by foot, the water dropped. By 2010, it had fallen to about 1,082 feet. By 2016, it was bouncing around 1,075, the official threshold for a federal shortage declaration. Wet winters in 2019 and 2020 gave it a brief reprieve. Then the reprieve ended. By the summer of 2022, Lake Mead had dropped to approximately 1,040 feet, roughly 190 feet below full pool, the lowest level since the reservoir was first filling in the 1930s. The lake that had been the largest reservoir in the United States was barely a quarter full. Boat ramps that once sloped gently into the water now ended in dry, cracked mud 50 feet from the shoreline. Marinas had to be relocated, then relocated again. As the water receded, it revealed things that had been hidden for decades. A World War II-era Higgins landing craft, sunk nearly 200 feet below the surface, emerged near the marina. So did human remains, bodies in barrels, victims of what Las Vegas police suspected were mob killings from the 1970s and 80s, preserved in the cold, deep water and now exposed by the retreating shoreline. The lake was giving back its secrets, and none of them were reassuring. In August 2021, the Secretary of the Interior made the first ever shortage declaration on the Colorado River, the first time in the dam's history that the system could not deliver what was promised. Arizona took mandatory cuts of 512,000 acre-feet, roughly 18% of its annual apportionment. Nevada took cuts. California, protected by its senior water rights, first in time, first in right, the oldest legal doctrine in Western water law, initially did not, a fact that enraged Arizona and Nevada and confirmed their oldest suspicion that California had rigged the game from the beginning. The politics were brutal and deeply personal, played out in congressional hearings and closed-door meetings and increasingly sharp public statements. 7 states that had spent a century building economies on the assumption of abundant water were now being told to use less, and each one argued that the other 6 should cut first. 29 Native American tribes with unquantified water rights, tribes that had been deliberately excluded from the 1922 negotiations despite a 1908 Supreme Court ruling that recognized their claims, watched the basin states fight over allocations that had never accounted for tribal sovereignty. Mexico promised 1.5 million acre-feet by treaty in 1944, watched the river that once reached the Sea of Cortez in a broad, fertile delta dwindle to a trickle that most years no longer reaches the ocean at all. The jaguars are gone. The cocopaw fish in irrigation ditches now. Southern Nevada, to its credit, saw this coming earlier than most. The Southern Nevada Water Authority launched one of the most aggressive water conservation programs in the country, cutting per capita water use by 58% between 2002 and 2025, even as the population grew by nearly 900,000 people. Las Vegas paid homeowners to rip out ornamental grass, up to $3 per square foot of turf replaced with desert landscaping. The city banned new front lawns entirely. It recycled almost every drop of indoor water, every shower, every flush toilet, every load of laundry back into Lake Mead through a treatment system, earning credit against its allocation for water that was returned to the lake. The famous casino fountains on the Strip, which looked like extravagance, actually use a tiny fraction of the city's supply, and the water in them is recycled. It was an extraordinary achievement in civic discipline, a desert city that learned, under pressure, to use less water per person than almost any major city in the country, including many with ample rainfall. And it still wasn't enough, because the problem was never just about conservation. The problem was arithmetic. 16.5 million acre-feet promised, 12 million or less actually flowing. No amount of low-flow showerheads can close that gap. The water agreements that govern the Colorado River system mostly expire at the end of 2026. The 7 basin states have been negotiating new operating rules for years, but as of mid-2026, they haven't reached consensus. The upper basin states and the lower basin states have submitted competing proposals to the Bureau of Reclamation, and Reclamation has released its own draft alternatives that would impose new delivery reductions beyond anything previously attempted. Lake Mead, as of mid-2026, sits at about 1,052 feet of elevation, below recent averages and heading lower. The Bureau of Reclamation's projections suggest it could drop below 1,020 feet by mid-2027, which would be 20 feet lower than the 2022 record. Lake Powell, upstream, is in even worse shape. Its April to July 2026 inflows are forecast at just 15% of normal, the lowest on record. There is a number that engineers and water managers discuss with a kind of clinical dread: 895 feet. That's the elevation of Dead Pool at Hoover Dam, the point below which water can no longer flow through the dam by gravity. Below 895 feet, the turbines stop. Below 895 feet, no water passes downstream to the aqueducts and canals that feed Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, Tucson, the Imperial Valley, and millions of acres of farmland. Hoover Dam doesn't run dry in the conventional sense. It simply becomes a wall with a lake behind it that is too low to get through. We are not there yet, but we are closer than anyone imagined when the dam was built, or when the suburbs were platted, or when the casinos went up, or when the aqueducts were laid across the desert. The foundational bet of the American West, that the Colorado River would always deliver, was made during a wet spell and enforced by an engineering marvel, and for nearly a century it paid off spectacularly. Cities rose, fortunes were made, food was grown in places that get 2 inches of rain a year, and 40 million people built lives in a landscape that, absent the river and the dam, could sustain a fraction of that number. Frank Crow, the man who drove the dam into existence through sheer will and a refusal to sit behind a desk, walked away from Hoover Dam with a $350,000 bonus. He went on to build 4 more dams, including Shasta Dam in Northern California, then retired to a cattle ranch in Redding. He died of a heart attack on February 26, 1946, 10 years after the dam was completed, never questioning whether the river he'd tamed would keep its end of the bargain. The dam was engineered to last centuries, and it will. Core samples taken in 1995 showed the concrete was still gaining strength. The structure itself is not the problem. The structure is, by any measure, a masterpiece. The problem is what it was built to hold. The Imperial Irrigation District, with its 1901 priority date and its senior water rights, has begun paying farmers to leave fields dry during the hottest months. Farmland prices in the valley have dropped 20 to 30%. The last sugar refinery in the western United States, the Spreckels plant in Brawley, shut down in July 2025. 5 generations of beet farming in the Imperial Valley finished. The lettuce and broccoli and carrots that stock American grocery stores every winter still grow there, watered by canals that carry Colorado River water at the rate of 1 million gallons a minute. But the growers now work under the shadow of cuts that could reach 10% or more in any given year. In Phoenix, city officials insist the water supply is secure, that decades of planning have built resilience into the system. And they're partially right. Phoenix has diversified, has banked water underground, has built a buffer. But 40% of that buffer still comes from the same river, and the river is shrinking, and the population is still growing. And every new data center and lithium mine and subdivision adds demand to a supply that is physically, geologically, stubbornly finite. Las Vegas, that improbable oasis, survives on the smallest Colorado River allocation of any state, 300,000 acre-feet, a number set when the city was an afterthought and nobody imagined 2 million people would live there. 90% of its water comes from Lake Mead. By the early 2000s, the original intake pipes, built when the lake was reliably high, were approaching the water line. If the lake dropped below them, the city would lose its supply. So the Southern Nevada Water Authority spent $817 million to bore a third intake tunnel, 3 miles long, drilled through the lake bed itself to reach deeper water. It was completed in 2015, a feat of tunnel engineering as ambitious in its way as anything Frank Crow did in Black Canyon. The new intake sits low enough to draw water even if the lake drops to 1,000 feet. It was an engineering triumph born of desperation. A city of 2 million drilling deeper and deeper into a disappearing reservoir because it had, quite literally, no other source. The white ring on the canyon walls around Lake Mead is a record written in calcium carbonate, deposited by decades of mineral-rich water that is no longer there. From the air, from the hiking trails, from the deck of a tour boat, it is the most visible feature of the landscape, more conspicuous in its way than the dam itself. The ring is what the West looks like when the numbers don't add up. 7 men in a room in Santa Fe divided a river based on 20 years of unusually wet weather and called it permanent. A man named Frank Crow bent a canyon to hold the promise, and for 90 years the promise held, and the desert bloomed, and the cities rose, and the lights came on, and no one driving down the Las Vegas Strip, or watering a lawn in Scottsdale, or buying winter lettuce in the Chicago grocery store had any reason to wonder where it all came from. The ring is wider this year than it was last year. It is almost certainly going to be wider next year than it is now. The dam stands exactly where Frank Crow put it, 726 feet of concrete and American ambition, still gaining strength. Behind it, the water that made an empire possible quietly, steadily falls.